Hi, and welcome to the CIPD London Organisation Development and Design Sessions. We've got a session that's coming up on November the 15th at 12 o'clock. And these are sessions that we run regularly for organisation development and design practitioners that are looking to develop their practice, look for new ways of working, and also potentially for HR practitioners that are doing a little bit of OD in their role. So each quarter we bring a really brilliant guest along that's actually out in the field doing great work and exploring cutting edge practices. And this month is absolutely no exception. We've got the brilliant Mark Eddleston. And Mark Eddleston is basically really focused his career on new ways of working. So he really focuses on sort of imparting practical, thoroughly tested and actionable insights that basically can be implemented into organizations. And a lot of his work is about actually empowering people to go to their organizations and to run experiments and practice new ways of working. And it could be in a whole variety of fields. It could be in decision making, meetings, how we self-organize, how we give feedback as well. So it's going to be a really interesting session that we've got coming up. And what we also do as well is that not everyone can make these meetings. So we actually interview our guests. And so we're very lucky that Mark has accepted our invitation to sit down with me just to talk about his practice, his career to date, his influences, and also just to give a few examples of what it looks like in practice. So I know you'll find it really interesting. I'm really lucky to book guests that I'm really interested to learn about, and Mark has really stood out for me as someone I'd like to invite. So thank you so much for joining us, Mark. We really appreciate it. Mark, are you okay just to introduce yourself, and how did you find yourself to dedicate your career to new ways of working in organizations?
Yeah, sure. And thank you you did a great job of introducing me there. I'm not sure I can top it. But I'm a new ways of working consultant, and that involves being a guide to organizations who want to experiment with new ways of working and the patterns found in progressive organizations. Sometimes involves coaching and delivering training and workshops and kicking off their new ways of working journeys. And how did I get into it? Well, I spent the first 10 or 12 years of my career, so up until around about 8 years ago, working in pretty traditional organizations in terms of how they were organized. So I started out at British Council in around about 2005, which was a really great introduction to the working world. But in terms of their ways of working, it wasn't, you couldn't describe it as particularly progressive. And I spent a good few years there because it was a really nice working environment. And then I kind of moved, so that was in Manchester, and I moved to London and tried some other jobs. And a real mix. So I worked in charities, I worked in government, I worked in consultancy, corporate social responsibility. And what I found was that I'd get quite frustrated. So I would land on paper, really interesting roles and often kind of arrive and make a splash. And then I'd find myself getting frustrated by things like bureaucracy or meeting overload or ineffective meetings, or that there wasn't a culture of feedback. So if I had some feedback to share with my peers or colleagues, well, it just wasn't the done thing. Maybe you have an appraisal once a quarter and you might get an opportunity, if you're lucky, once a quarter, sometimes annually, and that would be your sole opportunity to offer some feedback, if indeed it was 360, and more often than not it wasn't. So I'd find things like this frustrating, the ineffective meetings, the lack of feedback, a lack of clarity around roles. The decision-making was kind of really top-down, and the people at the top often didn't have the context of the people on the front line, so they weren't necessarily making better decisions. And my response to that was to kind of twist, so I moved from Manchester to London and then tried a few different roles in London, and then ended up in Sydney and then Melbourne. And I guess I had what I've heard described as a patchwork quilt of a career for the first 10 or 12 years or so, trying lots of different things and ultimately concluding that probably I was the problem rather than the way that the organization was designed or the way that it was working. And I think it's probably fair to say that I may have got a little bit more frustrated than other people, but perhaps not a whole lot. If we look at that statistic from Gallup, that 85% of us are disengaged at work. I mean, it's mind-boggling, isn't it? The stats slightly worse in the UK. I lose track because they do the study every year, but they needn't because it doesn't change
it's
very
pretty
much.
Consistent stats, isn't it?
Yeah. So it turns out I wasn't alone, and so I kind of hop around and then ultimately landed in Wellington in New Zealand, working for a law firm called Community Law. It was the first time I worked for an organization that had a really clear purpose. So our purpose was to meet unmet legal need. And everybody could tell you what our purpose was. And interestingly, we had a boss who didn't really want to be the boss. So he'd grown the organization from just a handful of people to something around about 30. In doing this, so there's law centers all over the world. And Wellington Law Centre was regarded as the best. Let's look to what they're doing. We had about 200 lawyers volunteering for us, providing a near full-time service for people who had unmet legal need. 3 of them were QCs. They were supported by a small army of law students. There was another couple of hundred or so, and I think maybe 100 or so law students who all told us that they actually learned more at the law centre than the law school, which I can well believe, because the exposure that they got to the advice that some of these lawyers were giving, and 3 of which were QCs, was just phenomenal. So the service was incredible, but as it had grown from just a handful of people to something near 30, they'd done what many organizations do and added in middle management. And it just didn't suit the organization. And it led to some tensions and some challenges. So the leader of the organization began exploring different ways of working, and that involved reading books like Maverick by Ricardo Semler, and books about Spotify, and books about Netflix, and kind of other pioneering organizations. And it was also around about the same time that Reinventing Organizations was released. I think it was about a year after that had been released. And we happened to be in Wellington in New Zealand, which is a bit of a hotbed for progressive ways of working. So he had some friends in some really interesting organizations, and he was doing a lot of reading. And then one day he asked us to, I remember him photocopying chapter 2.3 from the book Reinventing Organizations, which at the time was probably like the leading text in this space. Many, many more books have arrived on the scene now, which is great. But at the time, that was it. And there was also the Corporate Rebels blog, and my dog's just arrived. There was a Corporate Rebels blog, and Reinventing Organizations, and not much else. So he photocopied chapter 2.3, and that was the section that said, okay, well, if you want to replace that traditional top-down style of management, command and control, and all those different layers, you're going to have to replace it with something. And chapter 2.3 explained some options. So he had us go away and read that, and then show up to an all staff away day in this beautiful coastal location in South Wellington. And he basically asked us, do you want to work in this way? Do you want to try this for now? And to his surprise, the whole organization said, yeah, let's give this a go. So we did the very next day. And the kind of flavor of organizational design that we went for was something called self-management, which I became really, really interested in. I remain interested in. I think at the time I thought this was the answer. This will, bullet. And that this will kind of spread and finally topple, traditional top-down ways of working that help to disengage 85% of the workforce. So I was very excited about it. I'm since not so sure that it's the silver bullet. I think in certain contexts it's wonderful, and in others it doesn't suit so well. But in this context, it was great. And the first step that he made was to kind of give control away. He said, I don't want to be making all the decisions anymore. When it comes to hiring, you know better than me who you want to work with, and you know what the needs are in your team. When it comes to kind of strategy and salaries and you know all of these decisions that are typically taken by the leader, he said, I want to share some of those. I'm not going to give them. I'm not going to, you know, disappear off onto the golf course, but I want to make them collaboratively with people where that makes sense.
Which is quite radical, isn't it?
Yeah, it really was. Yeah. So he kind of said, look, if you're going to be helping with the decision making, then you're going to need the information. So here it is. It's transparent. And, you know, with the exception of a few files in the HR folder, all information became transparent. And he even emailed the link to share our salaries. It's like, I'll save you digging. Here they are. Wow. And there was quite a gap between, you know, his salary and the next one lower. And he said, look, I see that. Now you see that. I'm not comfortable with it. Let's address it. And he proposed that a working group form. And he said, look, I'm going to stay out of this. But if there's other people that feel, as I do, that this ought to be fixed, then form a working group. And some people, quite a few people were more than willing to work on that, work in that group. So they did, and they took that problem and had control over making proposals around it. So we had a meeting about it, and we introduced different meeting structures. The one that stands out was the circle discussion, or sometimes that's called talking in rounds. And that began the next day as well. So we had distributed decision making, we had transparency, and we began with different ways of having meetings. And that ensured that it wasn't just the highest paid person in the room doing all the talking, or the you know, the extroverts. We had structures in place to ensure that there was equal talk time. Now, I didn't know about it back then, but equal talk time is a building block of psychological safety, and psychological safety is, you know, one of the top indicators of high performing teams. So we've got research from Google, from Harvard, and from MIT that all conclude that they all their research question was all loosely, what is it that makes some teams more effective than others? And they arrived at the same conclusions. That is, you know, above average social sensitivity. So there's, you know, average empathy in a group is higher, but of course we can't change that in the short term very easily. The second factor was equal talk time, which of course we can change. You know, later today or tomorrow, we can introduce things like check-ins in meetings, or use structures like lean coffee, which is wonderful, or, you know, use circle discussions and make sure that we talk in rounds. So we began discussing issues like the discrepancy in salaries using these meeting structures, and having formed a working group, we were introduced to something called the advice process, which is a decision-making technique. And that involves, essentially anybody can make any decision if you're using, you know, pure advice process. We do talk about something called the waterline. So if I propose that we spend all our reserves on some risky new project, then someone can say, hang on a minute, Mark, this is exciting, yes, but it's also a little too risky. If we do that, it's kind of below the waterline. If that fails, the ship might sink. So that's a bit of a safety net, I guess, for the advice process. But most people aren't proposing things that might sink the ship. And you introduce language such as, you know, safe to fail. Is it safe to try? So the working group on salaries had meetings using the new meeting structures and made decisions using the advice process, which is very, very simple. And it just involves when you spot a problem or an opportunity, speak to all the people who are affected and anybody who has expertise. And if that's all staff, then we used Yammer, because this was quite a few years ago, although it is still around. I'm a fan of Yammer, but you could use Slack or you could use Microsoft Teams. Don't email all staff because that's a nightmare for following conversations. Yeah, but that's what we used to seek advice on decisions that affected all the organization. Because of course, getting together a group of 30 people and having a discussion is very, very time consuming. So we'd use technology that would enable us to do things, to carry out our work asynchronously.
Can I ask one question as well? Because it's almost like you're sort of saying, and it happened the next day. And it's a mindset shift, like it's gone from 0 to 10 almost immediately, and you're really tackling like really sacred cows like salary. Like that's when it comes to transparency in an organization, that's literally the last thing that gets revealed, and it does cause a lot of tension. Were people given training to sort of try on these new methods, or is it very much kind of like, no, just these are the platforms, learn how to do it?
Yeah, so we were given lots and lots of information. So we practiced the meeting structures routinely. And we had some really great facilitators helping us to do that. The advice process, we were given the instructions. We all had the instructions, and the leader said, "Look, this is new. We're not going to get it right first time. I've read a lot around it, although the instructions is just half a page. It's not. You don't need to learn a whole new, textbook in order to do it. It's very, very simple." But he said, "Look, come and speak to me if you need any help in using this, or if you're not sure who will be affected or who has expertise. Yeah, ask around, or ask me." So yeah, we were given training in other areas such as feedback. So that was another kind of pattern that you find in progressive organizations and in self-managing organizations. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I didn't think it was a great idea to start there. In hindsight, I do, because, and not that I suggest that all other organizations should do it. We just happened to be ripe for this. We were kind of ready for it. But I think I think now that it was a really smart move because everybody had skin in that conversation. So everybody wanted to show up to the conversations, which meant everybody was exposed to, they were interested in this newly transparent information. They wanted to take part in the conversation. So they were learning about how to have effective meetings. A working group formed the next day because there were enough people willing to kind of, have a role in shaping, in kind of shaping a proposal to address this problem of pay discrepancy. And and they were introduced to the advice process. So it meant that a lot of patterns could be introduced. And if you were to do something perhaps a little less controversial, I don't think we'd have had the same level of interest. So it meant we all learned very quickly because it was such a juicy topic. And
I guess the role of the leader was so important in that, wasn't it? As soon as he starts to introduce the idea of salary and let's discuss it, that sends a signal out to the rest of the organization. This is really serious as an initiative.
Yeah. Because how often I remember my first, my first job, and very early into that, there was what's it called? UK operations change, so a giant restructure. And there was about 1,000 people in the UK in that organization. So it was a big, big change, huge restructure that we've all probably experienced. Nothing actually changed. A few people, moved roles and a few role titles changed, but essentially almost nothing changed. And it was huge. It was a huge operation that lasted so many months. And meanwhile, there was a recruitment freeze and a lot of disgruntled temporary staff who were doing great work for the organization but couldn't be brought in because of the recruitment freeze. Such enormous effort for very little return. And then I think they realized that it didn't go so well. So 2 years later, did exactly the same. Yeah, we just kind of saw, again, not a lot of disruption and not a lot of real tangible change. So it didn't feel real. And often these kind of change, these top-down top-down restructures don't feel that real, unless, of course, they're involving redundancies, and then it feels very, very real. But in this case, it was just a lot of upheaval for not much change, and this was a huge contrast because we were kind of in the driving seat. We now had control, and we'd been given power and decision-making rights, and new tools and structures and training, and we were kind of all steering the ship to the extent that we wanted to, which perhaps sounds like a free-for-all, but it really wasn't, because if people had a proposal, they had to follow the correct process, which was the advice process. And I certainly had ideas that I would seek advice on, and learn that they weren't very good ideas. And I previously, so then you take that off the table, or go back to the drawing board and edit it. Whereas previously, I would have just made that decision. And I think in organizations, that's still how things go. If you're in a certain position, then you have power to make changes and make decisions. And there's not always that advice seeking or consultation. In fact, there usually isn't. So you can just go ahead, make these changes without having spoken to the people who will be affected by them. And I think that's a big contributing factor to that 85% of us that are disengaged at work.
Incredible. Yeah. And I think what really sort of stands out for me for these new progressive ways of working is it's often a bit of a misunderstanding. It isn't a free for all, is it? I was interviewing Gwen Sterling-Wilkie the other day, and she just sort of described something as, I thought was a really good term, freedom in a framework. So it's bounded, but within there you have all the freedom. And if you want to go outside of those framework, then there is some governance around it as well, isn't it?
Yeah. It's a real misconception that it's all, it's the Wild West if you bring in some more progressive ideas. In fact, it tends to be more constrained, but they're healthy constraints. They're things that there's decision proposal templates that you can use if you want to seek advice. There's guidance around meetings, and what's the meeting rhythm, what structures, what are the options for the meeting structures that we can use, how do we feed back to one another. I mean, there's so many models out there. My favorite is one called brain-friendly feedback by an org psychologist called Leanne Renninger. I love it, and there's a wonderful 5-minute TED talk. If you search brain-friendly feedback, you'll find it on YouTube or on TED. And it's exceptional, and you have these tools available to you, and these frameworks, and kind of it's really, really helpful, and hopefully it's all written down as well. Usually, I think when these patterns are not written down, it's just a bit of a mystery. Well, how do we do things around here? We default to management, and it's never really clear how what's the process if I've got some feedback in the moment to deliver to my boss. Can I do that? Hopefully, hopefully, in many organizations people can, even without this in writing. But I know that in many other organizations, it's really not the done thing to feedback, certainly in that direction, with constructive feedback.
Yeah, because it got me thinking, because I think in organizations you get a lot of variance, don't you? So, like you think about the sort of XY axis, you'll have a bell curve. So you'll have people at one end that do give feedback and some that give exceptional feedback and a
Mm,
lot that don't. So if you do codify things like how we make decisions,
yeah.
you reduce a lot of the noise. If you codify how we give feedback, then that expectation is out there as well, isn't it? So again, you're starting to get consistency across the organization.
Yeah, and kind of taking care about the quality of the feedback, because I can just go, and give unvarnished feedback willy nilly in all directions, and it's not necessarily helpful. Um, but then if I follow a framework such as brain friendly feedback, step one is checking your intention. Um, let's say I've got some feedback for you, Karen. Am I just a bit miffed about something that you've done? Is my intention to kick you in the shin because I'm annoyed? And also because I woke up on the wrong side of bed? And that's the first thing that you check. And then it's like, no, I'm annoyed here. So why don't I kind of reframe my intention and be helpful? And if you're not able to do that, then throw the feedback away because you're just trying to hurt someone by kicking them in the shin. So check your intention and make sure that that's good. And then ask, hey, Karen, I've got some feedback about this project that we worked on recently. I think it could be helpful for the next one. Do you mind if we have a quick conversation? Then I've given you the opportunity to receive the feedback or not. Very often it's just foisted upon us and it can be a bit of a shock. So that's the brain friendly part.
Mm.
I've checked my intention and then I've given you a heads up. And more than, hey, can I give you some feedback? If you receive that message at 9 in the morning and then, can I give you some feedback at, 4:30 this afternoon? Then I'm going to be worried all day. Unless I've kind of heard what it's about. Can I give you some feedback about this project we're working on? I've got some ideas to make it even smoother. I'll be like, okay, great. Nothing to worry about here. And then the feedback model begins to kind of sound and look like so many of the other ones out there, like SBI, situation, behavior, impact, and so on. But essentially, you use data. So say what happened, and then explain the impact, link the impact of that data. So let's say you'd arrived late to a meeting. Hey, Karen, you arrived late to that client meeting. They were putting me on the spot with some really tough questions that you know the answer to and I don't. And I felt really vulnerable, and it didn't look great on the organization either. Now, had you indeed arrived late, you can't argue with that. But if I'd have gone in and said something like, hey, you're always late, then you'll probably get your back up. So, no, I'm not. So, don't give them anything that they can argue against because you're only using data, and then link that event or that, or that situation to the impact that it had on you. What was the result of those actions? And then we're learning about the impact that we have on the people around us, which is an enormous source of growth and just really, really useful information if we can all be aware of the impact that we have on others. So one might be, if you've ever been in a team where somebody routinely raises their voice, they might not realize that that makes some people feel uncomfortable. Or a team leader who always starts meetings late or kind of always has meetings run over, and then you're getting in trouble for arriving at your next meeting late. And they might not just be, it might be that they're not aware of the impact that these things are having.
I think the big thing I'm sort of taking away from this, like with the feedback and obviously the speeding up of decision making and like the advice process, so not having to wait, to sort of see something, take initiative, that when progressive ways of working are introduced, organizations just start to flow a lot more. So rather than the sort of build up of tension around feedback building up and then eventually it's either an outburst or passive aggression or whatever it is that you see in organizations, is that something that you notice within the organization, that things started to flow and potentially speed up over time? I don't want to give you a leading question because I'm just really keen to hear what the output of all this change was in this organization.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I've worked for a few organisations that have used the advice process now, and I've worked with other organisations that I've introduced it to, and it does tend to speed up decision making for sure. I think previously you might, if you have an idea, I might share it if I've seen other people's ideas, lead to something. Or I might share it with my boss, and then they were like, "Oh, I'll speak to my boss," and then weeks pass, and then it comes back down the chain. It's like, yeah, they're not gonna run with that idea, or silence. You never receive any feedback on that idea.
True.
I think that hinges on the relationship with your boss, and whether you're in an whether you're comfortable making proposals to them, whether you've seen them take other proposals forward. And if you don't see that, you probably won't make any suggestions. So with the advice process, anybody can make those proposals, and you don't have to, and the manager doesn't have, and I'm not saying that all managers do this, but the manager doesn't have the opportunity to be a blocker, which is a real kind of power move, and a traditional hierarchy enables that. It might be that a subordinate has a wonderful idea, but I just don't like them. So I'm just going to sit on that and block it. And yeah, great things don't happen, or kind of progress takes a lot of time. Whereas with the advice process, there are some steps, and it can initially feel a little clunky, but it's something that you get better at, and that's something that becomes quicker. And yeah, ultimately, I'd say it leads to faster decisions.
Fantastic. And so obviously you left Wellington, you've now set up as a consultancy. I really want to ask you some questions about, you've developed sort of an online course, haven't you, that you sort of take a regular cohort through, and it's starting to create a real kind of body of evidence and research out there that you're really keen to sort of mine. Can you just talk people a little bit more about like your online course, what it does, how it equips people, and these experiments that you're getting them to do?
Yeah. So, yeah, I've got a course that's called New Ways of Working. It's been, I think it's, 3 years old now. So I'm in the middle of cohort 13. And each cohort is 12 people. Occasionally it's been extended. And 12 people come along, and there's some eligibility criteria. So you can't have been sent by your boss. So you
No
must be,
mandated.
which is, it really helps the group to the kind of, so I've led trainings where people have been sent, and it doesn't feel as good for the participants or for the person leading the course. But when you've got a bunch of people that really want to be there, and they want to be there because they're fed up of traditional ways of working, they're feeling some frustrations, and they're open to experimenting with new ways of working. You've just got a dozen people who are up for trying some experiments around their ways of working. So the course is 5 weeks long, and in between each week, participants are asked to design an experiment, and we do that in a live session. So they'll be paired with an accountability partner who helps them to design an experiment. I give them lots of each live session, there's been some reading and there's a theme. So in the first week, we look at the challenges that are typically found in organizations, because they're generally the same. Regardless of the sector or the location, we get fed up by having too many meetings, or meetings that don't lead to action, or there's not clarity around my role, decisions take ages, I don't understand the purpose of the organization. The same grievances are felt in across most organizations. So we have a look at those. What are the challenges? What are the things that are annoying us? And that's to give us some inspiration for those experiments. And then in the second week, we look into teamwork. What makes a great team? And we dive into that research from Google and Harvard and MIT, which leads us to psychological safety. In week 3, we're looking at mindset and power, and how how our core assumptions affect our willingness to experiment with new ways of working. And we also kind of begin to think about power and who holds it. And then in week 4, the theme is decision making. And in week 4, it's feedback. And in week 5, the theme is decision making. And then there's a couple of threads that weave through the whole course. And one is meetings. So in learning about all of these themes and reflecting on the course content and reflecting on our experiments, we use meeting structures such as circles. We always check in. We always have a clear purpose. We always have a clear plan. We always check out. And we'll use things like circles or liberating structures to reflect on the course content and on the experiments that we've done. So that's one thread that weaves through effective meetings, and the other is experiments. So about 12 people on each course, each designed 4 experiments. So we've got about 50 experiments for each cohort, and there's now been 12. And cohorts sometimes self-organize after the course has finished and get together and design more experiments. So there's more than 700 experiments. And yeah, I recently began kind of codifying, what pattern does this experiment relate to? And it's been really fascinating. And also because when you've got that many experiments, and some of them are wonderful. So I had a guy from Mercedes-Benz who indiscriminately cancelled every other meeting because he was fed up with how many meetings he had to attend. And he came back and he said, I told my team about it. I told them it was an experiment. And you know what? Nothing happened. Nothing bad happened. I just had loads more time to get loads more important work done. Another fantastic experiment, somebody from the Soil Association, similar problem, too many meetings. And so they said, right, I'm really feeling this, and I know that my team is feeling this too. So I'm going to create a meeting budget. Everyone can have 15 hours per week in a meeting. So choose it wisely. How do you want to spend those 15 hours? And that meant they could kind of not attend some of the meetings that were less important, and have 20 or 25 hours to do the work rather than be in the meetings. So some of the experiments are just really, really, really impressive. Others, so all the meeting experiments are coming to mind. So one from last week was somebody who was just aware that they generally do a lot of talking in meetings, and having learned about effective teamwork and psychological safety, they realized that this wasn't helpful, wasn't helping to create psychological safety. So their experiment was to not speak, not be the first person to speak in meetings, and to try and talk a whole lot less. And yeah, other experiments involve feedback. We always get lots and lots of feedback experiments. And yeah, a really nice and simple one is inviting feedback. So it's creating a culture of feedback is a challenge. But one thing that you can do, particularly if you're in a leadership position, is routinely invite feedback. So then you're kind of creating a necessity for people to practice giving you that feedback. And then we also delve into the different types of feedback. So we learn about, so for example, you've got appreciative feedback, you've got coaching feedback, how can I do this thing a little better? And then evaluative feedback, okay, against your expectations, how am I performing in my role, for example? So learn about the different types of feedback, and then invite the type of feedback that you're craving, and make a habit of offering feedback a couple of times a week, let's say. So I'd say, yeah, the experiments, when I think about the patterns found in progressive organizations, the 3 that stand out the most are from the experiments on the course: effective meetings, trying out distributed decision-making techniques, So that's a very simple experiment. One leader of an organization came along and said, I'm not going to make a decision this week. And every time somebody comes and asks me for a decision, I'm going to say, what do you think? And I will give them advice. I'll give them advice if they like it or if they're struggling, but I'll encourage them to take that decision, provided it's not going to sink the ship, which is unlikely.
It's really fascinating, isn't it? Because we get stuck in these patterns, and even though like manager and employee, so employee going to manager becomes dependent on them to make decisions, takes away their initiative, makes it feel slightly less bad. Even though it's deeply dysfunctional, we still find ourselves in those patterns, don't we? And a
Yeah,
really small change, so one part of that equation changes their focus and actually pushes it back, can make all the difference, can't it?
yeah.
It's quite incredible. How do people come back after running experiments like that? You know, does it feel cathartic? Are they like what's the general kind of feeling when they come back from an experiment that's worked well?
I mean, yeah, when it's worked well, they're usually pretty chuffed, and yeah, they've they might have a happy team, or they've kind of they've made a meeting better, or they've proposed something when they're not used to proposing decisions, or allowed others to make decisions. Yeah, it's a good feeling when it goes right, and there's a bit of a buzz when it happens. But they don't all go well. I haven't ran
Experiments.
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So there's been a whole lot of failures in there as well. But that's great. We kind of celebrate those, and we focus on when we reflect on the experiments. Because all I'm trying to do with the course is have people build their experimentation muscle. You can read all the books you want and listen to all the podcasts, but if you're not practicing new ways of working, you're not going to make any progress. So you've got to try stuff, see if it works. If it went well, do more. If it didn't go so well, ditch it, or adapt it. So there's loads of failures, and they're great because they're rich with learning. And I ask participants to focus on that learning and share that learning. So as a group, well, they've got their accountability partner that they'll have shared that failure with, because they meet outside of the live session and share how the experiments went. But then we kind of reflect on them in small groups as well, so that everyone can benefit from the learnings from failures and successes. And I think some of the main learnings are just to keep it small, especially because the experiments, the course is weekly, so it has to be small because there isn't much time. But yeah, keep the experiments really, really small. The smaller the better. And keep it, make sure it's safe to fail. Don't have it hinge on too many other people. So if your experiment can't take place until you've received 3 reports or something, it's like, well, somebody might get sick or somebody might be late with that report. So don't have it hinge on external factors or other people.
So I have so many questions. So obviously with organizations, you've talked about Mercedes-Benz, multinational manufacturing company, soil association. I'm assuming there's a trading body or some kind of trade association. Every context is different. And we live in a world where we like to read a book that's got a 5-step process. And if you do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you'll get the guaranteed outcome. But our organizations are all very different. They all have their own histories, management structure, all that kind of stuff. What role does context and complexity sort of play in your mind?
Oh, huge. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm really lucky that 20 years ago now, I was studying complexity at undergraduate level. Yeah, and that was at Liverpool University. And at the time, that was one of 2 places in the country or in the UK that were teaching complexity at an undergraduate level. So it's something that I've been familiar with for a long time, thankfully. And of course now, I remember my tutor, Dr. Samir Raihani, the best educator I've ever encountered. He said complexity is going to become a social metaphor. And of course it has. Everybody's talking about complexity. I'm not certain that everyone understands what it means entirely, but at least it's, at least people are hearing about it. And the role that it plays, well, yeah, I always talk about my partner when discussing this. So it really helps to understand the nature of the system that we're working with. She's an engineer. So in an engineering world, cause equals effect. You're dealing with linear systems. They are predictable and you can control them up to and including rocket science. So, Elon's going to blow up a few rockets, but once he's figured out how to do it and how to get them up there and do whatever they're doing and back down again safely, that is repeatable. And you can do it today, you can do it tomorrow, perhaps weather permitting sometimes. It's, you can predict and control that environment and kind of engineering environment. And there's that phrase, isn't there? Well, it's not rocket science. I wish org design was as simple as rocket science, and it isn't. So my partner works in satellites, and there's actually she used to work in propulsion. There's an equation. There's actually what they call it, the rocket equation. That So you can predict and can control propulsion. You know what needs to happen to get your satellites up and into orbit. It's repeatable. When it comes to teams and organization design, there's no equation. There's no recipe. And if something works at Spotify, it doesn't mean it's going to work in your organization. So context is so important. And the reason it doesn't work, the reason that a way of working over there won't necessarily work over here is because of the nature of the system that you're working with. So when it comes to people, we are all complex adaptive systems. Put us in a team, then that's a bunch of complex adaptive systems all interacting unpredictably, and therefore the outcomes are unpredictable also. It strikes me that most leaders are still understanding this. We haven't sort of got there yet, and we can see evidence of that with even after events like COVID. We're still looking for business plans. What's your 5-year plan? I'm like, well, our 5-year plans were torn up when COVID came along, weren't they? And our financial financial reports are never accurate, but we still do them and we spend so much time on them. And they're not accurate because they're not rocket science. Mm-hmm. I wish they were, but they're unpredictable. They're complex. So yeah, the context and complexity are two massive factors, and that's why experimentation is key. So if things were predictable, we would know, just do it like this. Here's how you do it. Follow these 5 steps. And that isn't the case in our teams and in our organizations. So you've got to experiment. And even in one organization, a way of working that has wonderful results in one team might not yield the same results in another team. So there's so many layers of complexity. It's not just that the two organizations are different. The teams within the same organization are going to be different, and they each need to experiment to find out what works for them in terms of effective meetings, in terms of the culture of feedback that they want, in terms of how decisions are made, how their roles are structured and organized. And the only way that each individual team can figure that out is by constantly experimenting and constantly adapting. And it's not something that you finish. So it's a little bit like the garden. You don't go out and do your gardening in May and then sit back for the rest of the year. You've got to constantly tend to these patterns found in progressive organizations, because when a new person joins a team, the dynamic's completely shifted. So it might still work, the way that you're working, but it might need to be tweaked.
And I'd love to get your view on one thing, because I think sometimes it all feels a bit too exotic. It's like, okay, so self-managed teams, that's the end of management. And, do you sort of see it where for new ways of working to really flourish, do you need to get rid of management hierarchy, or do you feel as sort of a place where they can coexist, where you can have new ways of working and have traditional management hierarchies?
Yes, yeah. I think it's definitely possible for them to coexist. Um, some people quite like traditional ways of working. Most don't. That Gallup data shows us that 85% of us are not super engaged, but some people don't mind at all working in that way. So I don't think it's appropriate then to kind of force alternative, more progressive approaches on contexts that are actually quite happy and performing well. I think that with new ways of working, and that's why I kind of no longer champion self-management so much. If it's appropriate to your context, then great, give it a go. For most organizations that experiment with things like agile or self-management, I guess I regard it as window dressing, because I've worked in 2 self-managing organizations. They were wildly different. In my job as a consultant, I work with many organizations that identify as agile. They're completely different. They both have they all have a totally different interpretation of what that means. So I think rather than kind of aiming for some label or window dressing, as I like to call it, we're better off just focusing on those patterns that are found in progressive organizations. And if there's an organization and on the whole it's receptive and open to experimenting with new ways of working and putting time and effort into finessing those patterns that we find in progressive organizations, except for a team over here that's really quite happy working in traditional ways, great, leave them to it. So long as good work is getting done and people are engaged while they're doing it, then I really don't think it's that important how you do it. It just so happens that there's a lot of evidence to indicate that these patterns are ways in which you'll have more success.
Which I guess is quite liberating, because it means it's not all or nothing.
Yeah.
It's about progression almost, isn't it? How can we progress our processes to move forward? One thing I just want to ask you about as well is just, you've consumed an enormous amount of insight and articles, and sometimes it can feel really overwhelming. Like, well, where do I get started? And you talked about sort of Frederick Laloux's first book about organizations, and since then there's been a whole plethora of new materials. You've actually curated a lot of this stuff, haven't you, and organized it under headings, so people getting started can actually see that, like, here's a structure and here's some how, and here's some what is this playbook you've developed, and how can people access it?
Yeah. So the playbook, the idea came from a podcast I listened to with Amy Edmondson being interviewed by Lisa Gill on the Leadermorphosis podcast, which I recommend. And this particular episode is great with Amy Edmondson, and she spoke about a playbook at the end. And then I kind of thought, what a great idea. A playbook for new ways of working. And years passed and I didn't see the playbook. So I thought, well, I'll make it. And I'd been getting clearer in my mind about these patterns. What are the stable patterns that we're finding in progressive organizations? So I've spoke about them already, but just to list them quickly: it's effective meetings, distributed decision making, a culture of feedback, clear roles, a process around conflict, because it's going to happen, and then agreements on all of the above. So write it down. How do we do things around here? And That's not an exhaustive list, by the way. There's other things listed in the playbook, and if you speak to another New Ways of Working enthusiast, they might have a slightly different list to me. But other patterns in there are coaching, experimenting, psychological safety, teamwork, mindset. And for each of these patterns, I've as you said, I've consumed a lot of material on them, and I wanted to curate the highlights of that material. And so for most of the patterns, there's a section on practice. So if you look at meetings, for example, there's a section on theory and then practice. So if you would want to learn about effective meetings, I've curated a list of articles that you can read. If you prefer watching, then there's some video content for you to watch. And if you want to listen, then there's some podcasts. And if you want to practice, scroll down to the bottom of that section, and there'll be a button that'll take you to the practice section. And then it's just a list of some of my favorite practices for the given pattern. So in feedback, I've spoke about brain-friendly feedback already. There's a prep sheet to help you prepare for that feedback conversation. You can watch the video that I mentioned on brain-friendly feedback, and there's the written instructions. For decision making in the practice section, there's links to there's a decision proposal template that you can use. There's the step-by-step instructions for the advice process, and also another wonderful technique called consent decision making. And the same for meetings. So things like check-ins, circle discussions, lean coffee, all of my kind of suggested things that you can try. And to try them, you don't need to be a facilitator. All of the instructions are there, and the idea is that you kind of give it a go and build that experimentation muscle, and focus on the pattern. If you arrive at the playbook, choose the one that feels most frustrating. If meetings in your context are a real drag, well, learn about meetings.
Go with the energy.
Yeah, or head straight if you want to roll your sleeves up, head straight to the practice section and give some of those structures a go. And where can you find it? So there's a link on my website, which is marco, marco.work/playbook. Yeah, and I can perhaps send it to you if you'd like to distribute it.
Yeah, fine. Well, what we'll do is we'll make sure that there's a link to the playbook, more information about your website in the show notes that go along with this as well. So if you're watching this on YouTube, we want to make sure that everything we do is referenced as well. And there's some really interesting things you've sort of shared with us, is like sort of the brain-friendly feedback. So I'll probably put a link for that in as well. So, but for me, I've actually been through the playbook. It's intensely useful, and it's just a really good resource as well. Sometimes there's also a good reminder about the things that you ought to be deploying in the good disciplines as well. Well, I want to say a huge thank you, Mark, for agreeing to be our guest. So just to confirm for everyone, so it's November the 15th. It's at 12 o'clock. You can book tickets, they're free. You don't have to be a CIPD member, and it's available on the CIPD London Eventbrite site. So book your ticket. It's going to be a busy session. So far, I think we've had around about 170 people booked. Well, considering we started this group with 7 people, I think we're starting a bit of a movement now. But the reason we're growing the group is because people like Mark are freely giving their time to share their expertise and know-how that they've spent a lot of years learning and developing as well. I want to say a huge thank you, Mark, just because the work you're doing is so generous, like not only the online course, but it's things like the playbook as well. It's really democratizing this information so that everyone has it. So a huge thank you for that as well. And I'm really looking forward to spending time with you on the 15th of November as well. So thank you so much for your time, Mark, and I look forward to seeing you on the 15th.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. It was a lovely conversation.
Thanks, Mark.